The temperature reading on Selavas's forearm panel had already dropped 9 degrees in 40 minutes, and the Thyrath coastal city of Vale Soth was still standing, barely. She gunned the crawler's engine and took the corner at the top of Merchant Quarter Blind, trusting the thermal grid more than her eyes. The grid said the freeze front was 6 clicks out. The Compact's atmospheric modeling team, which had spent the last 3 days telling anyone who would listen that the polar vortex was stabilizing, had stopped transmitting entirely 11 minutes ago. Sela took that silence as her answer. The Thyrath had built Vale Soth on a shallow inlet bay. 300,000 people stretched along the coast in tiered stone and shell buildings that rose from the waterline like a reef. The species was semi-aquatic, comfortable in the 14 to 18 degree water that the inlet provided year-round, their wide flattened hands designed for pulling through current, their eyes set for the low-light turbidity of the deep. They were not built for what was coming. Nobody had been. The polar vortex collapse had begun 4 days ago as a technical anomaly in the upper atmospheric monitoring logs. It had become a catastrophe by yesterday morning, when the modeling team stopped calling it a wobble and started calling it a reversal. It had become a death sentence last night, when the Compact's regional coordinator, a stiff-spined Dravathi administrator named Orev Salon, declared that the projected temperature drop was within statistical survivability thresholds, and that emergency evacuations were logistically unfeasible at the present population scale. Sela had filed the counter-assessment at 300 hours from the cargo bay of her EAS transport. She had listed the Thyrath's core body temperature range, their metabolic cold tolerance ceiling, the projected rate of descent, and the projected arrival time of the freeze front at the Vale Soth waterline. She had attached the thermal imaging overlays showing the front's actual edge moving 8% faster than the model predicted. The Compact had acknowledged receipt. That was all. Sela had been in the crawler by 3:40. The EAS regional post had 3 vehicles and 9 personnel, including herself. She had split them into 3 teams, 2 crawlers running the northern residential tiers, 1 running the southern harbor district, and taken the central run herself with her partner Dovi Ren and their medic, Asha Preet. The central run had the highest population density and the worst road access. Sela had taken it because she was 22 years old and had been driving EAS vehicles through disaster terrain since she was 19, and because she had a particular talent for not thinking about anything except the next stop. The next stop was a community hall at Tier 4, intersection of Merchant Quarter and the Canal Approach, where the Thyrath Building Authority had reported a shelter population of approximately 200. 200. She could carry 30 per crawler load, and the freeze front was 6 clicks out, moving at an average of 4 clicks per hour, which gave her about 90 minutes before the waterline temperature dropped below the Thyrath survivability floor. 90 minutes, 6 loads minimum across 3 vehicles, and the road between Tier 4 and the inland staging ground at Cavell Ridge was 2.3 clicks of switchback approach. Dovi Ren, in the seat beside her, was doing the same math with a calmer expression than she felt. He had been with EAS longer than she had by 2 years, and had a way of running numbers without letting his face show them. 48 minutes per round trip if the road holds, he said. The road will hold, she said. The coast won't. He nodded and said nothing else. The community hall came into view at the base of the tier, its broad stone entrance arch framed by the pale blue streetlights of the Thyrath grid, which were still running on backup power. Outside the arch, a crowd of Thyrath civilians pressed close in the pre-dawn dark, wide bodies in their heavy layered wraps, flat hands gripping the arms of children, the humid warmth of their gathered breath visible in the air, which had already gone sharp with the particular cold that a moving front carries at its leading edge. A Thyrath municipal warden, a large male with the broad chest and silver-banded arms of an elder authority, stepped forward as Sela braked the crawler to a halt. His translator pendant caught the light. "You are Earth emergency," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Sella said. She was already out of the cab and moving to the rear cargo gate. "How many sheltering inside?" 186, the warden said. "I was told the compact said." "The compact said what it knew," Sella told him, and she said it cleanly without heat, while she dropped the rear gate and pulled out the thermal blanket rolls. "We're here now. I need your strongest adults forming 2 lines to the vehicle. Children and any with circulation symptoms first." The warden stared at her for a moment with the wide, still eyes that Thyreth used to read a face in low light, flat irises calibrated to read water, not air, but they could read intent just as well. Then he turned and began giving direction in the fast-clicking consonants of the Thyreth Lowland dialect. Preet was already moving through the crowd with a scanner, tagging circulation cases, calling out priority numbers. Dovey had the second blanket roll open and was pressing them into the hands of the adults forming the line. 31 Thyrath on the first load. Children and the 5 circulation cases Asha had flagged in the first 2 minutes. Sella pulled away from the arch at 4:18 and drove the 2.3 click switchback to Cable Ridge without letting her foot off the accelerator, except for the 3 sharpest blind turns, where dropping speed wasn't a choice. The inland staging ground at Cable Ridge was an open gravel plateau 100 meters above the coastal elevation, well outside the freeze front's projected path. The EAS regional director, Tomov Hale, was there with the reception team, 4 transport vehicles that could carry onward to the inland shelter centers. He counted 31 Thyrath off Sella's crawler and said nothing. He had been the one who signed her counter-assessment at 300. Some conversations happened in silence. She was back at the Merchant Quarter Arch before 500. The second load was 30. The freeze front temperature sensor on her forearm panel now read 2 degrees below the Thyrath cold tolerance floor at the waterline. The front was accelerating. Dovey clocked it at the same moment. "It's moving faster than even your revised projection," he said. "I know," she said. "We may not get 6 runs." "We'll get what we get," she said, and put the crawler in reverse to clear the arch approach, then forward toward the switchback again. They got 5 runs at the community hall. On the 3rd run, the crawler's thermal grid began showing ice crystallization on the Merchant Quarter pavement. The edge of the front was closer than 6 clicks now, and the street temperature was entering the zone where Thyrath physiological response would begin shutting down extremities within 15 minutes of exposure. Sella pulled the second crawler team off the northern residential tier and redirected them to a pocket of Thyrath families. The warden had radioed in from the canal approach. 40 people in a storage building with no power. She heard the northern team's driver acknowledge the redirect without complaint and change course. The northern residential tier had gone quiet on the thermal grid, which meant either the population had already moved or they hadn't. It meant they hadn't. She found out on the 4th run. 23 Thyrath, elderly and young, sheltering in the basement of a waterline structure the grid hadn't flagged, its thermal signature masked by the building's emergency heating coils, running since yesterday at capacity. The freeze front would walk through them like they weren't there. The warden had found them. He was standing in the street outside the structure when Sella's crawler came back down from the 4th staging run, and he flagged her down with both arms, which was the universal signal for things that had gotten worse since the last time she drove past. She stopped, he told her. 23 more. Basement. No ability to move the very elderly unassisted. Sella sent Ashad down with the crawler's portable heat units while she and Dovey physically carried the 4 Thyrath who could not walk the stairs. Thyrath were dense, wide-boned structure, heavy musculature, built for water pressure. Each one was close to 140 kilos. Dovey said nothing about it. Sella carried them because they were there. All 23 got into the crawler, which put them at 41 aboard 11 over rated capacity. The suspension groaned on the switchback. She drove it anyway. On the fifth run, the freeze front reached the waterline. She heard it before she saw it, the deep tonal crack of ice forming fast across the inlet bay, a sound like a world inhaling and holding it, spreading from the waterfront up through the stone and shell tiers in a percussion of thermal stress. The Thyrath in the cargo bay behind her went very still, even the children. She was at the arch. The warden was standing in the entrance with the last group, 37 people, the last third of his shelter. He was counting. She was counting. 37 and her crawler rated at 30. "We go in 2 groups," he said. "No," Sella said. She was already looking at the cargo dimensions, the mass, the road. "We go in 1. Get them in." The warden looked at her, that wide, still Thyrath gaze, reading her the way they read water, looking for the current that told you which way was safe. He got them in. 67 Thyrath in an EAS crawler rated for 30. She drove it up the switchback at a speed that made the vehicle's proximity alerts scream the entire 2.3 clicks, and she tuned the alerts out and watched the thermal grid and the road and nothing else. The freeze front was at the base of Tier 3 now. The street temperature at Merchant Quarter was 18 degrees below Thyrath's survival floor. 11 minutes of exposure would be fatal. She had 8 minutes of road. Dovey sat in the passenger seat and kept his hand on the manual override panel, ready to compensate if the suspension gave, and said nothing. Ashap Preet was in the cargo bay with 67 Thyrath, working through the ones whose circulation monitors were spiking, pressing heat packs to flat wide hands and the undersides of wrists where the Thyrath vascular system ran close to the surface. They came out onto Cable Ridge gravel at 6:07. Tomav Hale was standing there with the reception team. He counted 67 off the crawler, and his expression did the thing it sometimes did, went very flat and very still before he let it move again. He put his hand briefly on Sella's shoulder as she walked past him, and she nodded once and went to check the other 2 crawlers' status on the grid. The Northern Residential team had reached the Canal Approach group. The Southern Harbor team had completed 4 runs on a waterline community center and was on their way back with the last load. Total from Vale South Coastal District, across all 3 vehicles, 412 Thyrath civilians. Sella sat on the running board of her crawler and read the number twice. The freeze front had fully consumed the coastal tiers by now. The thermal grid showed blue-white solid coverage from the waterline to Tier 6. Vale South was under ice. 412. The Compact's regional coordinator, Orev Salon, arrived at Cable Ridge at 6:40 in a heated transport with 2 administrative aides. He stepped out and surveyed the staging ground. Thyrath families clustered around heat emitters, EAS vehicles, the mud and gravel lot crowded with beings who had been in their shelters 4 hours ago, and his expression moved through several things that Sella did not track closely, because she was writing her incident report, and the report was more useful than his expression. He walked over to where she was sitting on the running board. She kept writing. He said, "The Compact will wish to review the unauthorized use of emergency assets and the deviation from the approved. The report will be filed by 900, she said, without looking up. He said nothing else. He walked back to his transport. The warden found her 20 minutes later. He stood in front of her until she looked up, and then he did something that Sella had not seen a Thyrath do in 3 years of working the coastal districts. He brought both his flat, wide hands together, palm to palm, and held them in front of his chest in the gesture she knew from their liturgy. The gesture of the deep current, the one that carries you safely through what you cannot see. He said her name the way the Thyrath said names of those they intended to remember, full utterance, with the low tonal press at the end that marked a proper noun as something permanent. Then he said 412. His wide, flat eyes were steady, and there was in them the thing she had learned to recognize after 3 years of this work, not gratitude exactly, which implied a debt that could eventually be cleared. Something older, something with no comfortable equivalent in any language she knew. 14 teams from the nearest compact response station would have reached Vale Soth in 6 hours, he said. You were here in 30 minutes. Sella closed the incident report and looked out at the staging ground, the families, the children, the 412, then back at the warden. We monitor the polar systems, she said. We've been watching that vortex for a week. The warden absorbed this. The wide eyes did not change, but something in the broad chest moved, a long exhale, the way the Thyreth breathed out tension slow, measured from the diaphragm. Then you knew before we asked, he said. Yes, she said. He stood there a moment longer, both hands pressed together in the liturgical gesture, looking at this 22-year-old human woman on the running board of an overloaded crawler with ice still melting off its wheel wells, writing a report that would probably get her reprimanded. Later, when the Thyreth Coastal Authority submitted its formal account to the Compact Emergency Oversight Committee, they would note that Earth Emergency Atmospheric Services had responded before any official request had been filed. They would note that the response team had extracted 412 civilians from the path of a Class 9 polar vortex collapse using 3 vehicles and 9 personnel. They would note the deviation from rated load capacities, the unauthorized staging ground usage, the single-operator road decisions made under terminal weather conditions. Then the Coastal Authority would note, in plain, careful Thyreth, that the freeze front had consumed the entire coastal district in full within 9 minutes of the last EAS vehicle clearing the waterline road. 9 minutes. The Compact's committee would read that number and sit with it quietly. It was the kind of number that didn't need commentary. And somewhere in the inland shelter at Cable Ridge, 412 Thyreth, including 31 children, would spend the rest of that long cold day warm.